We have just a short time with Senator Jeff Flake, who is joining us this morning. And by the way, Senator, always great to have you on the air with us. I have to tell you, as I was getting ready to do the show, my eyes fell on a story, and I'm so glad that you're going to come on the air and talk about this. There's a story out today from the Washington Times he's a great reporter up there named Stephen Denan, who's just, you read one of his stories, you take it to the bank. He's writing that there are a number of legal scholars emerging saying that this law that Team Obama is talking about, the one that President Bush reauthorized in 2008, dealing with these unaccompanied minors coming up here, the Obama administration may be interpreting this law incorrectly. We may not have to keep these kids up here.
Well, I gave a speech on the Senate floor yesterday, and that's basically what I said, that the president has more discretion than he's letting on here. First and foremost, the biggest problem and what's providing the biggest incentive for parents or relatives to put children in this position is the fact that when they get here, they're placed with immediate family members or relatives until some future date of court hearing that they may or may not show up for. The president is not required to actually place those children. HHS is supposed to receive these kids within 72 hours unless there are exceptional circumstances. And you can really argue that this is an exceptional circumstance when you've got 57,000 kids coming across so far this year.
Yeah, well, all right, so we think that he has more latitude and leeway. But once again, you've got the executive branch of the United States vested in one man, and Congress can jump up and down and scream and point out and all of that. At the end of the day, it's his prerogative to ignore, to respond, to do nothing.
Well, one thing we do control is the funding, and he's asked for $1.8 billion for HHS, and the sole role of HHS here is to take and hold these kids and then place them out there. And if we say if we're going to appropriate any money for this, here's what you have to do. And so we will spell it out. I'm not saying that Congress shouldn't act here. We should and we will. But in the meantime, the president doesn't have to place these kids out. Second, the administration has the discretion to expedite or to trim the timelines for these hearings. The president could instruct DOJ, for example, not to agree to continuances for these hearings. And then third, for children already released to HHS, the president can tell them not to place these kids with people who are here illegally, for example. He can tell them, he can say, what the law says is they have to be placed in the least restrictive setting in their best interest. If the president acknowledges, which he does, that most of these kids won't be able to stay, the most inhumane thing, I would think, would be to place them with family members only to take them from those family members when they're deported back to their home country.
Yeah, well, this question of sending them back, once again, this is a story that popped up on the other Washington, D.C. newspaper, the Washington Times, where they did some research. And, what's the total amount president's asking for? 3.8, 3.9 billion?
3.7 billion. About 600,000 is for something completely extraneous.
If we paid for airline tickets for all of them, we take them back to the larger cities, wherever the airports are, in El Salvador or in Honduras or Guatemala, wherever they're coming from, and we take them back to the nearest place we can take them by air, where it's safe and effective and fast, the total cost comes to 0.5% of what he's asking for.
Well, there's certainly cheaper ways to do it than he's talking about. I'm not suggesting that it's as simple as just putting them on a plane back. We need to work with their home countries. We've got to make sure that that there's some kind of infrastructure there when we take them back to place them in. And so it may not be as simple as you're talking about, but we could do it a lot more cheaply than the president is talking about. And most importantly, it would stem the tide. I've said from the beginning, as soon as parents and relatives of these children who have just paid a smuggler, up to $5,000 to $7,000 to take their child north, sees a plane returning home with that child, then we'll solve most of the problem.
There's a story out today saying the coyotes some of these guys are making $50,000 a week carrying these folks up here.
Yeah, I think so. And part of the problem is, these coyotes, they know that drug smuggling penalties are pretty tough, and so human smuggling, we need to bring some of these laws where there is a tougher penalty, or as tough at least as the drug smuggling, because they're making a lot of money and don't face the same consequences on the other end. So Senator McCain and I have had legislation for a while, and we roll it into this new legislation to stiffen those penalties as well.
Well, so all of this is one new piece of legislation that, correct me if I'm wrong, it's going to clarify the 2008 trafficking protection to make it very clear that the president his hands aren't tied under that piece of legislation when these kids arrive here?
Yes, the House is working on that legislation as well. We have a version of it. Senator Cornyn has a version of it. So every serious piece of legislation to deal with this does make that change. But there are a couple of other things that we can and should do as well. Senator McCain and I, our legislation says that it would tie foreign aid that goes to these countries with a requirement that they cooperate with us to receive these children back. And that's important, because we don't want them dragging their feet and saying, hey, you just can't bring them back and dump them off.
Right.
Obviously, we want cooperation from the countries. Second, there are some legitimate claims of persecution that we ought to take seriously. But those cases need to happen. They need to be, those claims need to be made in their home countries. And to the extent that we need to beef up our embassies and consulates to receive those kind of cases in their home countries, and increase the number of slots to allow legitimate refugee status, then we should do that instead of dealing with it on our own border.
Let me ask you a comment on one other thing here. This morning we have a story that's running in some of the media that Senator Harry Reid said yesterday that the southern border is secure. He was talking to reporters after the Senate Democrats' weekly policy lunch. And he said that my personal belief is that the southern border is secure. And he said he spoke with Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, who, I'm giving you the quote now, he told me without any equivocation that the border's secure. Can you make heads or tails out of any of that? I'm trying to say, which newspaper is this in? This is an ABC story.
He did say that. I guess try to be charitable and say maybe he was referring to the southern border of Nevada and Arizona. I'm not quite sure, but that anybody who represents a border state would not make such a statement.
All right. So when do you believe that you and Senator McCain are going to have this bill ready to actually be introduced?
I was over on the House side this morning and talked to those who are drafting. I think the House will move first. They have a task force that Matt Salmon, I know, is serving on. They just returned from Central America. They'll have legislation tomorrow, and some of it will mirror the legislation that Senator McCain and I have put together and mirror some of the Cornyn Cuellar legislation too. So I think the House will move first. We have 2 more weeks of session before the August break, so it needs to happen obviously in the next 2 weeks. My guess is the House moves maybe Thursday or Friday, and then the Senate takes it up next week.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on the air with us. Best of luck in all of this. Keep us posted, and when you're back in town, please feel free to jump in, come down and join us one morning.
Will do.
All
hey,
right.
thanks a lot, Mary.
Senator Jeff Flake, ladies and gentlemen.